Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. We'll start here in about 60 seconds. Gosh, where's Roberto? I spoke to him. If anybody's seen Mr. Cadiz, please send him a text for us. In fact, we're just waiting for a panelist to show up, and we'll start right away. Thank you for taking your seats. We're going to begin here as soon as our panelist Roberto. There he is. Thank you. Well, as you may have guessed, you're in one of the more popular sessions of the 3 parallel sessions that are occurring now. And of course, it's a reflection of the urgency with which climate change is presenting itself. I have here with me 4 of the 5 panelists. I just got a phone call from Nicholas, who says he's on his way, but he's fighting not only fighting climate change, but he's also fighting Bangkok traffic. So I've asked him to, as soon as he arrives, just to run up on stage next to Miss Nolan to my left. So if I may begin. As many of you know, in fact, as I think almost everyone in this room knows, climate change is a primary driver of many of the world's top risks to humanity. Among these risks include water crises, biodiversity loss, natural disasters, and extreme weather events. According to the report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, staying on our current course will have unimaginable consequences for all life on Earth. And indeed, basic human rights will be under stress like never before, including the right to life. Climate change will have a severe impact on livelihoods, food security, access to health. Study shows that climate change will have a disproportionate impact on women, the vulnerable, and the poor. Despite these risks, many of our policies run counter to climate change solutions. The world spends trillions of dollars annually on fossil fuel and agricultural subsidies. These subsidies drive increases in greenhouse gas emissions. Our global market and financial systems externalize the cost of greenhouse emissions. According to the IPCC report, we are not doing enough to hold industries, governments, or each other accountable. We need to elevate plans and policies markets, and financial systems to account for their impacts on the climate and human welfare. This requires that we better leverage normative frameworks, monitoring tools, disclosure measures, and judicial and non-judicial mechanisms. Today, we are here to talk about what tools and mechanisms we have at our disposal to combat climate change and its impact on human rights. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Sean Lees. I work for the United Nations Development Program on the Business in Human Rights in Asia program. I'm happy to be joined today by 4 of the 5 panelists. As I mentioned, for those of you who just arrived, we're waiting for the 5th panelist to arrive at any moment now. Today, our colleagues will unpack the nature of the links between climate change and human rights risks. And for this, I'm happy to be joined by Ms. Justine Nolan, Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales, Australia. She's also going to examine how tools such as, or normative frameworks such as the OECD Multinational Enterprises Guidelines, but also the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights can be leveraged to further the implementation of both climate and human rights, the implementation of human rights and climate instruments. We'll also be joined by Alexander Mastrovito, Head of Sustainable Transport Solutions at Scania. He will help us understand what tools companies like Scania are using to measure and report on climate change impacts on human rights and share some lessons learned. We'll then hear from, as I recall, we'll then pivot to how judicial and non-judicial mechanisms can drive remedy for climate change impacts on human rights. And I have at my side here Mr. Roberto Cadiz, Commissioner for the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines. He will explain, among other things, how NHRIs can drive behavioral change of companies with reference to investigations recently launched against some big energy giants. We'll draw to a close with Marjay van Booten, Chair of the National Contact Point for Responsible Business Conduct in the Netherlands. She will, among other things, provide insights into the outcomes of a recent case brought against a financial institution, ING, on climate change-related impacts on human rights. As I said, Nicholas may join us later, and I'll have to fill him in on where we're at with the conversation. But in the meantime, allow me to open the discussion with some comments from Justine Nolan. Incidentally, I will be taking questions at the end of each of our presentations, which should last about 10 minutes each. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sean. And thanks all for your time here today. So my job is a little bit to help set the scene and link climate change and human rights impacts. Because a lot of time what we're seeing is that we're seeing people working in silos in this area. So there are people working on climate change as experts, people working on business and human rights issues, and a lot of the time we're not seeing the necessarily connections between the two. So my job in part is to emphasise those connections between the two and also look at the way that we're regulating those two issues. So it's becoming increasingly apparent to all of us that every human rights crisis that we know now will intensify within the lifetime of a child that is born today. We see that in the way that the weather and the conflict over resources will escalate, famine will worsen, there'll be scarcity of resources, poor and vulnerable populations are going to be hit the hardest. There'll also be increased movement between areas within countries and between countries. And there's a clear link between these climate change effects and also how business is involved in this issue. Both the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD Guidelines for Multinational Enterprises, which we've talked about today, have clear avenues for bringing both of these issues to the fore. The UN Guiding Principles broadly references the International Bill of Rights, and the OECD Guidelines specifically have a chapter on the environment that references issues like greenhouse gas emissions in the commentary. But a lot of the time we don't necessarily connect those two and how they're working. And we tend to think that climate change issues are not necessarily human rights issues. Increasingly, we're seeing from comments from UN treaty bodies and experts the link between this. There was a general comment that was issued just last year by the Human Rights Committee in relation to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which makes clear this link between the right to life and the impacts of both business and climate change. And so there are increasingly potential avenues for people to take complaints about government's perspective through traditional UN systems, which links environment and human rights, and also think about using options like the OECD guidelines to make complaints around this. And we're fortunate that we're going to have some discussion here later about how that's being used at the moment. And I think that the problem that we're seeing is that there hasn't been this integration between professional and academic interest with climate change and human rights. But it's very clear to me that in the documents that we've got today, the UN Guiding Principles and the OECD guidelines, that link is there and is clear. What I think is interesting is trying to think about also how we're proposing to regulate these issues. And there's three parallels that I would draw in sort of managing, in some ways, the politics and regulation of climate change and also human rights impacts, but specifically in this context, the issues around modern slavery, where there has been increased regulation in the last few years. And those three areas for me are things around definition and the challenges around climate and modern slavery in relation to that, the causal connection between the problem and the perpetrator, and thirdly, how we're enforcing regulation in relation to that. So I'll talk about those briefly before I hand over to Alexander. The first question around definition, I think, is interesting, how we're dealing with both climate change and modern slavery. And in some ways, what we're thinking about is we're delaying action until we have a perfect definition. And we don't have global resonance about those terms exactly and how everybody perceives them and thinks that they're the same. And I think in some ways, the perfect is the enemy of the good here. Modern slavery itself is not a clearly defined term at an international level. It's an umbrella term that incorporates a number of issues within it. And climate justice, we're seeing, and climate change, we're seeing increasingly defined differently by governments around the world to suit them at times with it. I think the key issue here is in framing the problem and framing the definition in a way that neither government nor business can ignore it. So when we think about the concept of modern slavery, there's simply no company who can be for modern slavery. It's just not feasible that a company says, well, actually modern slavery is not that bad, we're just going to use it in 20% of our supply chains. It's framed in such a term that every business has to be against modern slavery. And we probably haven't quite got there with climate change yet. Climate change is framed in a much more neutral way. When this concept came up in Australia a number of years ago, the concept was quickly sort of moved in part to a carbon tax as a way of regulating. And a carbon tax became something that businesses could legitimately object against. And so we have to think about how we frame these. The second issue in making the connection between human rights and the environment, in particular, is the causal link between action and inaction, both by companies and government. The modern slavery movement in the last few years has done a pretty good job of sort of trying to, particularly looking at modern slavery in supply chains, by causally linking the problem with the workers at the very bottom of the chain all the way through the supply chain to those at the top of the chain. And so there's a sense, in some ways, of responsibility throughout that supply chain. Now, with climate change, I think it's one of those areas where it's potentially everybody's somehow at fault, everybody's doing something, but it's not quite sure who it is or linking the problem with the perpetrator. And so there's that causal connection which is missing, which in some way is delaying action around it. And the third issue, I think, where there's links between the environment and human rights is looking at the way that we're enforcing and thinking about enforcement. And here you have parallels between sort of a method of soft compliance, cross-jurisdictional challenges, and also this preponderance of leaving it to the market to regulate both climate change and modern slavery. There's been a tendency, we've heard a lot in modern slavery recently, and we've heard a lot about new laws that are emerging in countries like the UK, Australia. Other jurisdictions are looking at broader human rights due diligence laws. But the majority of these laws, particularly on modern slavery, are comfortable at the moment with leaving it to ultimately the consumer to regulate the problem with it. And we've got some of that same thinking around the environment. One of the ways I think to think about it is some statistics I saw recently. The International Trade Union Confederation estimates that 60% of global trade depends on the supply chains of just 50 companies, which employ only 6% of workers directly, and there's a hidden workforce of 116 million people. And if we think about it in terms of climate, the Carbon Disclosures Project's 2017 report found that the 100 highest emitting entities were responsible for over 70% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. So 50 companies, in particular, involved in dominating a global supply chain, and then 100 companies. And so the response of regulators has been to say, let's leave it to the consumer. And we've got clear guidance about who is, in particular, causing a lot of these issues or in some way very seriously involved. And so I think it's in some ways to come back to the thing about those issues of where there's power, there's responsibility. So I know that's a Spider-Man motto, so probably not sufficiently serious for this forum, but with great power does come great responsibility. And I think that regulation that is going to simply rely on leaving it to the market or leaving it to the consumer to fix the problem, both for climate change and human rights, is going to come up short. So I'll hand it there.
Brilliant opening presentation there. For me, I really appreciate how clear you articulated the challenge of integrating human rights and climate change work streams. You mentioned the problem with definitions. Slavery is a little bit much more easier for people to get their heads around, whereas climate change can evoke different types of responses. It can be formulated, as you said, as a carbon tax, and therefore people can find a way to oppose it. It's harder to be in opposition of a modern slavery act, in fact. And then, of course, you moved on to the causal connections. Responsibility is more clear with regards to human rights abuses in the supply chain, whereas that responsibility might be more difficult to pin down with regards to climate change and impacts on the global commons. And of course, your last point about enforcement, that we leave the solutions to the market or to the consumer, and this doesn't do us any benefit with regards to deriving really hard solutions that, again, would better integrate the human rights and climate change work streams. Your first point, though, was well taken, because we also have this problem even within UNDP, is that how do we get the professionals from that working on climate change to adopt the same knowledge and skill sets to engage on human rights issues, and vice versa. So we have some work to do even in-house. So thank you very much, Justine, for those comments. Alexander, may I ask you to take the floor and give us a little review of the things that Scania is doing to measure its climate change outputs?
Of course. Thank you very much, Sean. And ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for having us here today. Now, my name is Alexander, and I represent a company called Scania, and we're not very well known outside of our own industry, but just to explain it very briefly, we are a manufacturer of heavy trucks and buses and engines, and we are part of the Volkswagen Group. So usually we see ourselves as quite a large corporation and an organization, but I think in this forum we feel quite small. Now, I want to make a point regarding the topic of today's discussion about the climate change related tools that are available to us as a corporation. But to understand or be more familiar with my point, which might be a little bit controversial, I'll just briefly start with where we're coming from. Now, we were founded in Sweden 130 years ago, and even though we are owned by the Germans now, this is very much part of our heritage and where we come from. And I believe that we started our sustainability journey some 20, 30 years ago, much earlier than what we're talking about here. And this was much driven by Sweden, who got a shock in the 70s when the oil price crisis hit. And from that, there was a lot of push to become more sustainable. So this meant that we followed a Northern European sustainability agenda where we looked at biofuels, we looked at combustion engine technologies to reduce our impact on the environment. So we've been pushing this for a long time, and we are familiar with carbon tax, we are familiar with a lot of regulations coming down on us, forcing us to improve in this area. So when we now are talking about ESG disclosures and so on, they are, how should I put it? They are not that useful to us, and the reason for that is that in the automotive industry, one of the defining, let's say, characteristics of our sustainability challenge is that we are 99% of our impact is in what we call scope 3. it's not in our business, the one we can control. But most of our impact comes from what happens with the vehicles after they leave our legal ownership. And this means that for us to analyze and improve our own operations, yes, this is good and it's necessary, but it doesn't really bring any material impact on the piece of the society which we affect. And this means that we are trying to find a way to link our climate change challenge together with our responsible business challenge. And just as we heard this morning, a lot of organizations tend to instinctively try to divide things up into more manageable, compartmentalized parts, as did we when we said that our corporate strategy would be to do responsible business on one hand and sustainable transport on the other hand. And sustainable transport is where 99% of our impact comes from. Now we're struggling with how we link these things together. And another thing is that it's not only about climate change here. Because if you look at the Volkswagen Group, we employ roughly 500,000 people globally. Most of these people sit in very nice offices in Western Europe. But we put out roughly 10 million vehicles every year, and 20% or something, 10% of those are commercial vehicles which employ drivers which work in those environments. So this means that 1 million new vehicles every year, part of a total global vehicle fleet of 1.25 billion. That means that we employ externally in the automotive sector, several tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people. And that is where the real challenge is. So how do we tackle a challenge that is not really within our own grasp, within our own ownership? And here is the real challenge for us. We say we want to drive the shift to a sustainable transportation system. And since this is not within our power to do on our own, we need to work with multilateral platforms. We need to work with government and legislators in order to give them the confidence to make the necessary changes to actually enact this change. Because in the end, it's not a technological challenge anymore. We have the technologies to be zero emissions. We have the technologies to improve driver safety. It's an economical and governance issue, and this is not something that we can solve on our own. And another challenge there is that when we try to push these new technologies, they are competing against these subsidies that Sean mentioned before. There's not a level playing field for electrified vehicles. There's not a level playing field for biofuels. There's not a level playing field for something as simple as airbags that we take for granted in Europe, but which is an additional cost. And if you don't have local regulations telling you that your vehicles need to have airbags, well, the operators are not going to install them. So how do we deal with this? Well, I think it really boils down to, and this is something we're trying to push for, and we're trying to push for it globally. And this is what kind of metrics that we have to guide our actions going forward, and towards what vision are we driving these actions. In most places, I would say there's a lack of a holistic vision for how a sustainable transport system should look, and there is definitely a lack of sensible metrics to guide us there. Today we measure growth and development in dollars and cents, but qualitative development, that should be measured in quality of life metrics. And we have certain quality of life metrics like average lifespan and child mortality, but these are too basic for the challenge of climate change. We need to move beyond that and have local air pollution metrics that guide us and somehow quantify and measure the impacts of climate change. So that's where we are. Thank you.
Made the mistake of turning off my microphone to save energy. Fascinating comments. It's not common that I run into someone in the private sector says we don't think that the tools that are out there for measuring climate change impact are sufficient enough for us. And you're focused instead on a holistic transportation, holistic transportation strategies as opposed to maybe just a specific one to the automobile or the transport, large transport vehicles is in order. And it also puts the onus back on government to address the issue of subsidies and address the issues of a level playing field and making sure that people who do have the technologies to produce either low or no emissions or deploy these low or no emissions technologies can actually do so and remain competitive and pay salaries to keep the lights on. So I really appreciate those perspectives, although it's a bit of a downer. I was hoping that we'd hear more about an effective climate change disclosure tool that you'd like others to use, but that's a part of our journey, no pun intended, to getting where we need to go. Okay, so with that in mind, let's turn it over to Roberto Cadiz. Commissioner Cadiz, as you may know, made headlines internationally for launching investigations into the climate change impacts on human rights, going so far as to conducting a press conference where I think you, in fact, invited 12 to 20 of the top energy companies in the Philippines to come and account for the impacts that their activities were having on the Philippines, and particularly in light of certain cyclones that had hit the country and other weather-related disasters. So, Commissioner, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you very much, Sean. So the title of this session is Tools to Address Climate Change and Human Rights Impacts. So as mentioned by Sean, in 2015, a petition was filed before our commission, and we agreed to open our processes to give the petitioners a chance to prove their case. It's a very first case to have been accepted by a national human rights institution where climate change has been framed as a human rights issue. So, but before I talk about the particulars of this case, I would like to also talk about the unique situation of National Human Rights Institution as an access to justice mechanism for addressing human rights violations, and sort of contextualize it in the table of options that provide access to remedies. So you have state-based mechanisms and you have non-state-based mechanisms. And under state-based mechanisms, you have judicial and you have non-judicial. And under non-judicial mechanisms, you would have NHRIs, such as our body, and administrative regulatory agencies under the executive branch of government. And if I may also add, the legislature, in a sense, is also a mechanism for addressing human rights violations. And the way they address it is by conducting oversight hearings and also by passing laws. So NHRIs are uniquely situated because, unlike courts, they are not bound by strict rules of procedure. They operate upon mandates. They can be more broad. The broad mandate is just to investigate human rights violations, to educate, to uphold human rights. And it is not, it does not have to be too technical. It can launch inquiries, and it has a large leeway in defining how these inquiries ought to be conducted. It must, of course, adhere to due process. It must be fair, but it does not have to be as technical and legalistic as regular courts that oftentimes, because of their legal gobbledygook procedural processes, tend to obfuscate justice instead of provide access to remedies. Aside from the fact that they're also too bound by the concept of precedence, decisis, meaning looking back at previous cases to guide them. And so oftentimes they're very slow in addressing issues concerning nascent uh, uh, co- cases concerning nascent issues where there are very few legal precedents. So in a broad sense, NHRI is indeed a tool for providing access to remedies. And within that tool are many levers that one can play with to make this access more effective. And the message I want to relay, which I will sort of expound later on by the way we practice it, is that the use of these tools may only be limited by your creativity because of the leeway that's provided to NHRIs. It can be as effective, as powerful as how creative the people operating these tools are. And that's the message that I want to relate to my colleagues working in national human rights institutions.
While you're flipping through your notes, can I ask a show of hands of any other NHRIs represented here? I see the chairman from NHRI Bangladesh. Anybody else? Just from Bangladesh? Oh, I'm sorry, Australia, of course, in the corner. Yes, how do you do? In Danish Institute. I'm sorry, yes, indeed, Danish Institute for Human Rights. So we got 3. Oh, 4, Myanmar. Great, 5. And you're from where? Malaysia, pleasure. So we have 6 NHRIs represented in the room right now. I'm sure they would agree with Commissioner Cadiz's statement that you can make creative use of the tool that the NHRI represents. Please.
And to continue, I would also like to make some statements regarding the nature and concept of remedies, which tend to stifle NHRIs in the way they operate or they utilize their mechanisms. The way we see our concept of remedies within our commission is not just in terms of awarding damages or in terms of issuing injunctions, injunctive reliefs. Remedies can be in the form of elaboration of rights. Remedies can be in the form of declaration of rights. Remedies can be in the form of conducting inquiries, the results of which may guide courts later on, the results of which may be utilized in cases that can be filed in courts. Remedies may be just by opening an investigation, causing prevention of further violation of rights, by exposing certain conducts that tend to violate these rights. So remedies can be as expansive, can be as creative as the one who is conducting an investigation. We don't necessarily have to constrict ourselves within the concept of remedies as applied in regular courts. So we see the role of NHRI as a part of a continuum for providing access to justice, assisting the courts in setting precedents, especially on nascent issues such as the relatively new issue of climate change as a human rights violation insofar as courts are concerned. If you look at the trend of how courts are resolving cases linking climate change to human rights violations, you will see that there is no clear direction because judges are sort of groping their way. It's very hard for them to establish a nexus between human rights and climate change. human rights and the environment, yes, but climate change as a specific narrow issue, courts are still grappling with it, although there are landmark cases that are happening now, if for those who are following, such as the one that recently happened in the Netherlands, the Urgenda case, and there are many other theories being developed and adopted by courts. But by and large, there is still some guidance needed by courts in regard to how they should be approaching this issue. And that is where human rights institutions, such as our commission, might play a significant role. So taking the expanded concept of remedies and the different mechanisms for providing access to justice, the contextualization of NHRIs is that of being a complementary body, of contributing to the synergy, of providing remedies, and also for encouraging cooperation among these mechanisms, especially as enunciated, elaborated under SDG 17. So now let me go specifically to our mandate. So our broad mandate as Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines is to investigate all forms of violations of human rights of the Filipino people. We do not operate too much on, as I said earlier, legal technicalities. We always invoke simply our mandate to investigate these violations. And for the first time, as I said earlier, a case was filed before us, and invoking our mandate and ignoring technical issues, which we felt were not substantive, challenges to our jurisdiction, which were mostly legal gobbledygook, as I referred to earlier. We did open our processes. What we did is that recognizing climate change as a global issue, because that the causes and effects of climate change are not limited within territorial boundaries. We said that our process would be global, that although we are a small commission in the Asia Pacific, we were going to conduct a global inquiry. We said that our process would be dialogical rather than adversarial. We said that we were going to invite experts, academic, legal experts, scientific experts from all over the globe to inform us on this issue, and that was what happened. We conducted hearings in Manila. Many of our hearings, I think we had 8 hearings in Manila, but we also conducted hearings in New York with the collaboration of the New York Bar Association. We invited experts. We were also able to conduct hearings in London, 2 hearings with the collaboration of the London School of Economics, where witnesses also testified. We conducted consultative meetings in other parts of the globe. We went to Netherlands to consult, also as a matter of due process, because as most of us know, one of the carbon majors is domiciled in the Netherlands, and we wanted to underscore the fact that if they were not willing to go to Manila to participate in our process, then we were going to the Netherlands to listen to them. Unfortunately, they still did not participate in our process, although they were kind enough to respond to our invitation by saying that regrets, we cannot attend. So, amicus briefs. That's a rhetorical question. Shell? All right. So, the petition filed before us was very unique because most of the respondents were not domiciled in the Philippines. How can we acquire jurisdiction? How can we hear a case against parties that are not in the Philippines? But then we said, we are not out here to award damages. We are not out here to compel people or parties to appear before us. If they do not wish to appear before us, then we will not force them, as we cannot force them. But we will continue with our inquiry and we will be coming out with our findings. And it is up to them whether they want to be heard and cited in our report. It's all a matter of due process for us, but we assured them that we were not going to award damages. So amicus briefs, friendly briefs were submitted by scientists all over the globe, by legal experts, and as I mentioned earlier, one of those who agreed to collaborate with us and agreed that we were not violating jurisdictional principles was the New York Bar Association. Symbolically, they agreed that our hearings in North America will be conducted within their premises. And as there really are no jurisdictional issues if you analyze this case and the way we conducted our inquiry. We were not technical, but we were very respectful of due process. Notices were sent. Our proceedings are, by the way, all transparent. In fact, even now you may access them in YouTube. All the exhibits that have been presented before us are out there in the public domain. And in fact, they are being disputed by parties even as they did not formally participate in our process. So we're very transparent. The hearing was very organized and fair. And it was global. It was informed by experts from all over the globe. So I'm running. Okay, so just to cut short, we will be coming out with a report in November, in time for COP25 in December, where recommendations will be given to all relevant parties. And okay, so just let me end by saying that insofar as NHRIs are concerned, the way we see ourselves is that our mandate is really to be more brave and creative, unlike courts, to challenge barriers and to raise the standard of human rights protection to higher levels. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And for your work. Can you hear me? I'm sorry. Yes. Okay, great. It's interesting. It's almost like you're operating in a court of public opinion, running these global hearings and or consultations around the world. You speak about how traditional courts have had a hard time grappling with the case between making the links between climate change and human rights. It's too narrow for them, or they're struggling, and yet because an NHRI is more creative, perhaps even looser structure with different kinds of mandates, you're able to take on one of the most, if not the most important issue of our time, which, again, traditional courts are struggling to come up with determinations for. I appreciate that you also you spelled out some of the limitations. You're not necessarily going after punitive damages. You're not finding guilt or innocence. And in fact, you're coming up perhaps with other kinds of remedies, such as declarations or the launch of new inquiries on a topic and bringing public attention to the issues. I have some questions, but of course I'm going to leave them and deprioritize them for yours in a moment. And I was going to move over to Marjay right now, but Nicholas Svengensen has just arrived, and he was going to provide that first sort of framing, helping us make the connections between climate change and human rights. So if you don't mind, Marjay, I think I'll go back to the original plan, go to Nicholas, and end with yours, because yes, indeed. And in part because the NCP Netherlands has such a, in my opinion, a positive story to tell and to leave us with. Whereas Nicholas may make us a little bit more depressed. Nicholas, may I start by just asking you to introduce yourself and then perhaps well, I'll let you do the rest. Please just introduce yourself for us.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Sean, and apologies for being late today. I came straight from the airport and the flight was a little bit late, so that's why I jumped out here on the stage a little bit late. So anyway, my name is Niklas Svenningsson. I'm working with UN Climate Change, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, based in Bonn in Germany. And my job there is really to look after a new part of the Secretariat that is looking at global climate action. Global climate action is basically trying to engage everybody who's not a negotiator in supporting the implementation of the Paris Agreement. Climate change is, in a way, the gravest threat that exists to human rights on the planet, because it does not threaten any individual groups, it doesn't threaten any people in certain specific situations, but it threatens all of us. It threatens to eradicate entire nations from the surface of the planet. It threatens to remove entirely the food production systems that we're having today. It threatens to generate massive climate refugee streams, some of which we are already seeing today. Access to health, access to water, and the whole infrastructure that goes with the society we know today is really under threat from climate change. And we are not doing so well with it. We have already today seen, and we register that we have a climate change of about 1 degree above pre-industrial levels, and the target is to keep it under 2 degrees, ideally under 1.5 to avoid the gravest consequences of climate change impact. So we are very happy that we do have an agreement that parties, after 25 years of negotiations, almost 20 at least, adopted in Paris 2015. It's the famous Paris Agreement. We're not good with innovative names. But anyway, so the Paris Agreement actually does recognize the importance and the links between climate change and human rights. And in the preamble of the agreement, it says that parties should respect, promote, and consider their obligations to respect human rights of all groups. It refers to the right to health, of indigenous people, of local communities, of migrants, of people with disabilities, the right to development, to support gender equality, empowerment of women, the intergenerational equity, which we're seeing now with Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future movement, the right to access to food, and rights to not be in poverty. And then it mentions all the SDGs. Now, this is in the preamble to the Paris Agreement. So you may ask if this is, important or not. It's not part of the operational part of the agreement. But the fact is that it is very, very important. And this was one of the issues that were deeply debated in Paris during COP21 when it was adopted. It is something that is it is a basis for everything that parties commit to, whether it is adaptation, mitigation, capacity building, technology transfer, climate finance. All of these issues need to be linked or take into account the human rights obligation of our parties. So that is a good thing. What is a little bit more troublesome is, of course, that if you say that climate change is a threat to human rights, acting on climate change can also be a threat to human rights, depending on how you're doing it. There are many, many examples of where well-intended, well-meaning projects to, for example, grow biofuel instead of to replace fossil fuels has actually happened in a very negative way and have affected local communities. And there are many, many examples of how climate action can go wrong. So in order to safeguard against that, there are a couple of different mechanisms that have been established in UNFCCC. The first one is an agenda item that was here from the very beginning. It's called ACE, Action for Climate Empowerment. It's about education, public participation, transparency, and training, and international cooperation to build these elements in all governments and in all countries. The fundamental idea is, of course, that if you have access to this education and training, can participate, the human rights will be better safeguarded than others. We have something that's called the local community indigenous peoples platform, which is a cooperation mechanism for indigenous people to share best practices, provide mutual support, and identify needs where we can support them from the global community. We have the Paris Committee on Capacity Building, which is similar, but not only for indigenous people, but for all of us. And finally, we have also a gender action plan, which is fairly new, and we just 2 months ago recruited our first gender focal point in the Secretariat. So things are moving in the right direction. However, this is what is happening between countries. It's not what's happening at the business level. If you want to take it down to business level, you first need to go down to the national level where every country, every party now have a national climate action plan. They're called the National Determined Contributions, NDCs. These NDCs are supposed and they are planned to be updated every 5 years until we reach the 2-degree target, ideally 1.5-degree targets. And it's basically a roadmap for how all parts of society in different countries can change their behavior to move into low-carbon society. And what we do need is basically we need to have a planet that is climate neutral by 2050 latest, ideally a little bit earlier than that. So we're talking about economy, infrastructure, transport, energy, services, consumption, production, the whole range of issues that you come across in your work. Now, so that is really important for companies because we are also working directly with businesses and non-party stakeholders. So local authorities, cities, regional governments, civil society. And they are now in a situation where they can start to see what the governments are planning to turn their societies into low-carbon societies. And they can either just wait to see what happens, or they can try to contribute to that by engaging in a dialogue with the governments. And depending on the country, we see that this dialogue is more or less difficult or easy. Some countries have well-established dialogues with different stakeholder groups. Other governments are really, really struggling even to get the bare bones of their NDC up and running. So what we're doing in the Secretariat, in addition to this intergovernmental work, is that we're also, as I said, trying to nurture cooperation among non-party stakeholders. And we are not UNEP, we are not UNDP, we are not ESCAP, we are not a field organization. And we don't want to be, but we think we can catalyze action. So in a few sectors where, so first of all, we are trying to coordinate all these different business initiatives that are around there, science-based targets and We Mean Business and Under 2 Coalition and C40 and sustainable transport and everybody else. So we are trying to work together to give them a voice towards our negotiators so that there's a dialogue happening there. But we're also going in a few cases we're seeing that not enough is happening. And one of the most interesting sectors, I think, is actually fashion. What you're wearing here, what I'm wearing here, comes from a limited number of large brands normally around the world. And last year we launched something we call the Fashion Charter for Global Climate Action, where we actually have a majority of the global fashion brands that have signed on to that. And what this Fashion Charter is doing is that it's coordinating their work. We're trying to give them a unified basis to work together to address the issue of climate change within their supply chains. Fashion is the third or the fourth largest source of greenhouse gas emission if you look at it as a sector. Most of that supply is happening here in Asia Pacific, Bangladesh, China, Sri Lanka, India, and a few other countries around here. So the problem that these big fashion brands have, that even the largest fashion brands has a very, very small voice when they're talking with their suppliers because there are millions of customers for suppliers. So they need to come with a big voice to be able to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the governments who can implement the policies on renewable energy, on different kind of services, and thereby also on associated human rights subjects. In fashion, human rights is, as you know, not a new issue. It's a very big issue, but it's not a new issue. Climate is a new issue for this sector. And by being able to link these different agendas, climate and human rights, we're also able to get a much more a louder voice by these companies and organizations. So I would say that if you're looking on business practices and if you're looking on tools that can enable human rights within the climate action agenda, or vice versa, climate action within the human rights agenda, I think that the pivot is the national determined contribution. It's a national action plan. And what needs to happen there is a dialogue between the local stakeholders and national government. And in the background, you have the principles on human rights integration in the Paris Agreement that you can refer to in those discussions. And this work is starting now. It has not been going on at all. It's starting right now. So it's a very interesting agenda. Thank you.
Fascinating, fascinating work. Thank you very much, Nicholas. And an important message is there for me. You know, pay attention to nationally determined contributions, the NDCs, as a major place for inputs, but also to help shape our work. And also that this message here that a combined advocacy, human rights, and climate change really amplifies the voice in this space in terms of our engagement with these major industries. So thank you very much for that. And indeed, last but not least, we'll hear from Marjay van Putten, who will talk to us about the Dutch NCP case that so many of you have heard about with regards to ING.
Does this one still work? Yes, in the back you can hear. Let me, before I start my introduction, let me also have the audience a bit more, let's say, active. Can I see hands? Who of you knew before coming to this conference about the OECD national contact points? Be honest. Not too bad, I have to say. It's better than I thought, but we know that it's an increasing group, of course, and we hope, of course, to have soon colleagues from countries in Asia that where the countries also become members of the OECD, and that we have NCPs that we can work together with. But now coming back to this issue, and as you say, and all my colleagues here at the table have said, of course, climate change hurts us all. And we have to hurry. I've heard this morning already. We have to hurry. There is maybe even when it's not ideal with measures, let's take them, let's act and see if it's not ideal that we can make them better during the process. It's a process of doing it. Okay, now the ING has been mentioned because when you were talking about a party in the Netherlands, in fact, to be honest, I didn't expect your answer, but it's of course maybe not surprising. I expected ING to be mentioned because that case is known. So there is time for more to be done in our country too. ING, as many of you might know, is a large Dutch and international operating financial institution, a bank. And they were accused of, well, they were taken to the NCP, the National Contact Point. We received the case by a whole group of an international group of NGOs, including Bank Track, following banks, Greenpeace, who else did we have? Oxfam Novib International, and the Dutch, well-known Dutch Institute Milieudefensie, let's say defense of the environment. And their issue was that ING was not following the Paris agreements and that they didn't have any concrete actions and targets to measure their investments according to, let's say, the emissions. What emissions? Is there any measurement that they can see what they invest in? And of course, as we know, investors should play an important role in all of this and could play an important role. So that was the issue. Well, ING, well, we first had, of course, to bring them around the table and to accept that they were going to sit at the table. That's what NCPs do. They offer, that's the wording of the OECD, they offer their good offices. That's the role of the NCPs. So you talk to the different parties and you ask them, are you willing to sit around the table? That's not always easy. Sometimes you have industries that are saying, well, no, thank you. We go ahead and we know how the world works and we don't need an NCP. That group is maybe, it's decreasing. Because you can see nowadays that the NCPs are more and more today playing a role. But okay, we convince the parties, and I'm not, as a mediator, I'm not going to tell you the insights of, let's say, such a process, but it's a long process. And it's all about trust building a non-judicial system. It's out of court, and it's where parties sit around the table. And this morning it has also been mentioned that there is time for different forms. In that sense, I'm also interested to learn from my colleague here from the Philippines. You are also not a direct judicial system. Maybe it works a bit judicial. We can say the same. It works somewhat judicial, but nowadays we have those tools to be used by people. So we sat around the table, and first of all, it was, well, let me also say about the Paris Agreement, the bank had a big issue here. It's known that the Paris Agreement is between states and not between companies. They had not been around the table. So the Paris Agreement, you cannot say company X or Z or Scania or you name it, another company has to fulfill the Paris Agreement. It's what states have to do. And they have to assure that companies do it by their legislation, by the rules they make. So that's first of all important to understand. Secondly, when it came to the other issue of the stakeholders, the group of NGOs who took it to the NCP, is this methodology for let's say the climate impact measurement. It didn't exist. There was no one. How can you measure an international bank in 70 countries, maybe financing medium-sized companies here in, I don't know, ING is probably also in Thailand. I think they're in 70 countries over the world. They finance all kinds of sectors. They're also in the coal industry. I come to that. So where do you start? And it was really, what we did was first of all understanding each other, the two groups. You can see on the table a group of management of the banks and their specialists, and the other side the specialists of this group of NGOs. We invited a lot of specialists in the outer, including a call we had with, I think it was New York, with the IPCC. So we had a lot of specialists. What are we talking about? How are we going to measure? Do we still have time enough? Well, I can tell you, it came out, ING in fact had already started before it came to us. They had started with the Terra program. You can Google it, I'm sure there's a lot about ING in the Terra program. They are trying to develop a system of how do you measure it, your investments. And so that we discussed first. And then, coming back to the OECD guidelines, by the way, if you look at the OECD guidelines and you look for the word climate change, you find 3 times the word climate. 2 times it's climate investments, investment climate, foreign investment climate, and there is one where climate is climate to build trust. That one is already a little bit in the direction. Then you ask yourself, how can you relate the climate change issue to the guidelines? Well, there is the environment program, there is the human rights issue, and there is the due diligence. I think that the due diligence is the most, well, the strongest to relate to the climate change issue, because due diligence, and let me ask here, who of you has really a definition of due diligence? Maybe I can see hands. Due diligence. Any clear? Well, see, no, well, that's quite poor. See, 1, 2, is that all? Do you think, one more over there?
Careful,
yeah,
she's going to ask you
due
to give your
diligence. Well,
definition.
there's a very good publication now of the OECD about due diligence. Let me try to give it here in short words, and maybe my colleagues here at the table also have a definition. It is to know that if you as an entity, not only companies, but it can be a government, it can be an individual, if you take action somewhere, for example, invest, or you make a product, before you start doing it, do your analysis, your assessment of the social, environmental, and human rights risks. Know what you're doing. You should know. That's in simple wording, and I hope to hear other definitions. I'm sure there's a lot of legal text about this. So that is what you can say to also investors in the first place. Do you know what you're investing in and what the impacts can be? So we sat around the table and they finally agreed that this whole process of coming to a measurement, it's now in process. They're going soon. I'm not aware at this particular moment of the real dates, but ING is really trying to come up with soon with, let's say, the methodology. And I can already tell you, and that's in the public, is that another group of banks is following them with this Terra program. And they have the other program. It's a new PACTA methodology. It's a climate metrics in the financial market. So there is two different tools, and I'm not an expert on how it in detail is going to work, but they're trying to develop methodologies for the entire financial sector. And I know they are praised already now by the UN General Secretary in Poland when they had the climate change meetings there. The other issue, what happened during the process was not easy for us, because when you relate it to the Paris Agreement, in the Paris Agreement is written the 2 degrees. We have not to go further than the 2 degrees. But during the process, the IPCC came out that 2 degrees is already too much. We should go to 1.5. And 2 degrees was already for ING quite a strong tool, because they have to operate as a bank between other banks, and that's what they call the equal level playing field. This wording I'm sure my colleagues know. The level playing field, if they are the only ones, they one day are maybe put in the corner, oh, those are those stupids that deal with that, and the others don't. You're out of business. That is a big dilemma for any company that wants to run as the first. How can they, so it's the competition between companies also. So that's why you need the countries to act, international organizations and companies. So one of the outcomes of our negotiations or talks with the two parties was that they all asked, they both asked the Dutch government, and with them of course other governments, to ask from the international Energy Agency to develop the roadmaps for the 1.5 degrees. It's important that the level playing field for all the financial institutions is equal. Then they will act. So that was the other outcome. And finally they will continue their discussion, and they will come up with data for their, so they have, let's say, I also have to look at my words here, the targets. They will have targets in the different sectors, let's say, to come up with it. And they start in Germany, the Netherlands and Belgium. It's a big market for them. And also to be mentioned is that they, by the year 2025, they no longer will finance the coal sector. What is a large sector for this financial institution? I think it's one of the largest finances in that sector. But there's much more to be mentioned, but let me leave it because I hope the public is also active.
And that's what you call good work right there. That's fascinating, and I really appreciate your efforts. On behalf of everyone here, thank you very much for the work of the NCP Netherlands. Just a quick question. When did the process start again? Did you say 2 years ago?
Yes, it's
About 2 years ago. And so in some ways I'm thinking that the NHRIs and the NCPs, because they're unshackled by some of the legal gobbledygook, that as Commissioner Cadiz put it, and because they're not looking necessarily for penalties and or assigning guilt and innocence, they can actually accelerate some of these solutions. You recall Professor Nolan put a question out there to our first panel saying, when are we going to get this journey over with? This journey's taken a little time, and let's light the fire. Actually, I'm thinking, I'm more convinced today than ever before that NHRIs and NCDs are one of those ways to get that journey moving on climate change impacts on human rights. So again, I thank both of you for your work in this area. The second thing you mentioned, the eco-level playing field. We always think of the leveling the playing field so that the first mover isn't penalized when they're addressing human rights risks. You're bringing the eco dimension to it. And you're also placing, in some ways, you're placing the onus on government. And it's important that I mention that now too, because as Dr. Deva mentioned during his plenary panel this morning, the Global Forum on Business and Human Rights will be talking about policy coherence and again, what's the role of states. So these are some themes that I hope that we'll take forward in Geneva. Okay, well, without further ado, we have about 20 minutes here to take some questions from the audience. And I've seen the chairman from Bangladesh put his hand up many times already, so I'm going to start with you, but I'm going to take 4. So please don't feel left out.
Okay, thank you very much. I am Riazul Haq, Chairman National Units Commission Bangladesh. So what I want to mention that from my domestic perspective, I'll raise some challenges which was also mentioned in the plenary session by Professor Suraya Deva. Number one is that, as you know, that Bangladesh is under tremendous threat of climate change. So, and but we don't have any such tools. What we can do as human rights institution, we can go for what was mentioned by Deva, that the climate change and the awareness creation, and also coordination among the different ministries, because the affected people, the sufferings of the people are also cross-cutting. So many ministries are also required to be there. But the reason of this, from my perspective, I'm saying the reason is that there are two reasons. One is this natural, because of depression in Indian Ocean, as well as the Bay of Bengal. So there is a huge tornado, and thousands and thousands of people are being affected. Even in Isla, in 12 years back, still the people are fighting with for survival. So still they are in that way. And another one is that by the foreign companies, so like the shipping companies, the ships who comes just before entering into Bangladesh area in the Indian Ocean, so they just discharge their fuel. And fuel is something so not, and it comes and the entire country is being polluted with these fuels. The fish and everything are being. And we have one advantage, as mentioned by Deva, that Bangladesh has a very big forest. The largest mangrove forest in the world is in Bangladesh. We call it Sundarban forest. Due to this forest, lot of tornadoes and a lot of climate changes are being saved. But because of this thing, this type of multinational companies, the way we are being abused, we are suffering like anything. So what we can do, as mentioned by one of our panelists, that equal level playing field. So where do we find the equal level playing field? And another thing I want to request UN working group that when any national or multinational company comes for any business, when they submit their project profile, I'll finish within half a minute. So, can we make some sort of human rights impact assessment? We have the system of environment impact assessment, human rights impact assessment to allow them to continue their business in the country. Thank you very much with this.
Can I just clarify that question? Can we make human rights impact assessments to?
When they submit any project profile, whether the national companies or the multinational companies, they come with some project profile, they gave a concept paper, so human rights impact assessment should be there. That's my request to the UN working group, Professor Suedeva and his team. Thank you.
Thank you. I know there's some questions on this side, but I have a tendency to just favor the side I'm looking. So let me just make sure. Can I take a question from this side of the room? I think I'm going to move around geographically. No? From the very good, very good. We're going to go back to this side. Gentleman in the back, and then to Dr. Deva, and we'll see if somebody in the centerpiece here has a question.
Thank you.
The lady in the back, okay?
Thank you.
Sir.
Thank you, sir.
And then please state your name and where you come from, and then please do articulate that question relatively quickly.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Phanindra Gautam, Ministry of Law and Justice, Government of Nepal. We all know that there is disproportionate impact of climate change on the countries and communities that have contributed least on emission of greenhouse gases. The existing tool and mechanism to address climate change are not enough given the enormity of the impact on human rights. For example, like in case of Bangladesh, in Nepal also, hundreds of thousands of people have been displaced due to drying up of water sources. So my questions in this regard to the honorable panel members is, what is the way forward? are they, can the measures we are taking enough, or we should must think beyond the box? Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Deva, and then the lady in the back.
Thank you. I'll be very quick. Excellent panel, very good and diverse perspectives. I just have one comment, and the comment is that whatever obligations states have to regulate companies, I will suggest that businesses, all businesses, have an independent responsibility to ensure that they don't contribute to climate change. So, sorry? Due diligence is part of it. So the responsibility is a wider concept. Due diligence is one prominent tool that we have, but it could have many elements, including access to remedy, including making this commitment, providing technology to countries. So let us say, I would argue that the companies have a responsibility to provide technology to other companies and other countries where the poor technologies are contributing to the climate change. So I will argue that as well. And my question to all the panelists is that should collective impact assessment become relevant in the context of climate change? Because normally we look at each company has a responsibility to do the impact assessment, right? But climate change could be something very diffused also. So can we think of a new idea of doing the impact assessment?
Very good. Thank you very much. To the lady in the back, and then I'm going to allow our speakers to answer, and I may, if I have time, take one more question after that. Please introduce yourself and the organization you're with.
Good afternoon. My name is Caroline Garcia. I'm an intern in the OHCSR. My question is related to partly to biofuel. Because we know that it's causing deforestation and indirectly emission of greenhouse gases. So my question is if biofuel is one of the requirements that regulation that companies have to follow, how do we do if this regulation will not at the end lead to a result that will reduce our impact on climate change and to lead to sustainable solutions?
Can you articulate the question one more time, please?
Sorry?
Can you repeat the question one more time, please, for our speakers? To be honest with you, it's quite hard to hear some of you. The speakers seem to have two different sources, and when it comes off your microphones, it's very, very dim up here. And I promise you, I won't do justice to the questions that were asked. So I'm trying to do a favor for the speakers to ask you to repeat the question, please. Thank you.
So my question is that if biofuel is one of the obligation measure that companies have to follow to be more sustainable, if this measure will not lead to an effective result because biofuel is creating deforestation and emission of greenhouse gases. So how do we do if companies are kind of leads to think that they are doing better, but they are actually not doing better because it's creating another problem at the other side of the chain?
Right, right. Okay, I think you understood at that time, yes? So there have been several questions, and as I said, I may not do justice to them all, but we've heard several themes that I'm going to put to all the speakers, if I may. First is there's two questions actually related to human rights impact assessments and whether they should evolve. Can we think of new ways of articulating new pathways for human rights impact assessments, collective impact assessments? There's also, well, you asked what is the way forward. Let's leave the first set of questions to the role of human rights impact assessments on climate change impacts. I think it's an important theme. So let's start with Nicholas down here, and of course there were other sub questions asked. Feel free to answer every and all questions that you heard on your side. Forgive me again for my inability to hear some of them the first time around.
Yeah, well, I mean, on the human rights impact assessments, I'm probably the least suitable person to respond up here in this panel, so I'll take that very briefly. I mean, just to say that the issue about, our first speaker was mentioning about the issue about shipping, international shipping companies that releasing fuel into the ocean, which is then killing off the mangroves on the coastline of Bangladesh. We see that happening quite a lot, actually, and something that was surprising to us, actually, because there's another UN organization called the International Maritime Organization that is supposed to look after that, and they are not really, if I may say so, on the forefront on climate action. They're catching up, but they're not there yet. And this is not, this is beyond climate action. It's environmental management and sustainability. We have seen a number of very large shipping companies joining the global charter for fashion charter for climate action. To our surprise, we did not understand that, or we did not foresee that. So I think there is a nascent growing awareness about the impact of logistics, actually, both in what they're doing and how they are doing this. But this is, for me, it's close to piracy of coastlines, and I think this is something that you cannot. You can deal with in two ways. One is education and training, to have that education training of the captains who are responsible. The other one is hard legislation. I think they're the only ways forward on that one. Let me just take one of the other questions, and I'll leave the other. In terms of what do we do, I think the last question here, what do we do if there's not enough impact from voluntary action of companies? If they are saying we recognize that we have responsibility to do our due diligence and apply our corporate social responsibility and contribute to the global combating of climate change, and it's not enough, what do we do? Well, I think there are again more than one way of regulating a company. I mean, one thing is to have very hard legislation, but you need to be able to enforce it also. You need to be able to justify it politically, and that is maybe the largest problem we have in the climate area, is that very many of our decision makers are politicians that have a time horizon of 1, 2, 3, 4 years up to the next election, while climate change is here for the long run. But that is one way of doing it. The other way is, again, I think, soft incentives, working through financial institutions to decarbonize their portfolios, to reward companies that are more proactive on climate change and human rights, and to give less favorable conditions for others. And then again, education. I think is important. So, but I'm letting the mic go down here.
Whoever wishes to speak next.
Sure.
Justin.
On the question of, are measures enough, voluntary enough? I mean, in the business and human rights movement for the last 20 years, we've been relying on largely voluntary self-regulatory methods, and it's not working. And we can't now go down that path with climate change and say, well, let's just see how business goes, and if it doesn't work out, then we'll regulate more. We don't have that much time in our hands. We can sit in meetings like this forever and think, this is a problem, but it's a problem that affects all of us in a very short time. But more importantly, it affects the people who are not in this room. So I've spent part of this week with a great group of human rights activists from around the region here with the diplomacy training program, and a group of Indigenous people who are working in their area where their environment is being destroyed. They don't have till 2050 to wait for that. And so we can't keep having these discussions about a softly approach in relation to it. Because the problem a lot of the time that we're not addressing is the business model. So it's the business model in the fashion industry, it's the business model in the shipping industry, it's the business model in the car industry, because we're not prizing the costs that it takes to deal with these problems. We're setting up a business model where suppliers are sort of getting screwed at the bottom end of the business model, and so we're not building climate and human rights concerns into those models. So government certainly has a role in terms of regulation, but business has a role in leading to think about the true costs of countering climate and human rights and building it into that model. The last point I would address would be Surya's question around collective impact assessment. And I think this is particularly relevant around climate. And I think that what we're seeing in other sectors, in the broader business and human rights movement, is a very sector-specific approach to things like human rights due diligence. And I think climate, that's particularly pertinent, that there's an incentive for business as peers to work together in particular sectors. And I think we need to think about what incentives there are for sharing information to do collective impact assessments, because particularly around climate, it's very hard to pin things to one company. And Marta talked about that, the challenge of assessment. But if we look more generally at specific sectors and build in indicators that way and impact assessment, I think that would be a more sensible way to go.
Thanks. Let me first answer the question from over there about thinking out of the box here, and this is a bit adding on to what you just said here. And the transportation industry stands for almost 25% of global CO2 emissions, and it's growing. Obviously, the strategy and the approach we have is not working. And also to the comments that were made earlier, climate change is new on the agenda. Well, climate change was mentioned as an essential risk and human rights issue already in the World Commission for Environment report in '86. So it's not really and even earlier than that, in the 70s. So we cannot allow ourselves 30, 40 more years of inaction here. And this was mentioned in the morning sessions, that we have a strategy of continuous improvement here. You know what the Japanese call Kaizen, but this is not the time for that. This is time for path-breaking changes, what they call kaikaku, right? And I have one good and positive example, actually. You said I was a bummer before, so let's share a positive example. And Shenzhen in South China, where they have completely replaced their whole bus system, 16,000 buses into electrics, and almost all their taxis are already replaced into electric vehicles. So it's not a problem of technology here, it's a problem of economics and politics. Of course, they also have industrial interests in promoting this technology as they have it indigenously there, but it can be done. And then there was a question from the back about biofuels and adverse effects, and we have experienced these adverse effects firsthand, because our sustainability strategy from the start was to go biofuels, because this preserved the existence of the combustion engine in vehicles. The combustion engine is the largest value creator in the vehicle, which means it's core for us to stay profitable. But then we realized that first of all, there is not enough arable land in the world to supply all vehicles with biofuels. Then we realized that the societal effects could be very negative outside of a Northern European context. But now we're standing in front of the challenge where, okay, we know we need to go electric, but our current business model is not profitable in an electric world. So this transition is going to hurt, but we know we need to do it. And that's why we're asking for politicians and legislators and society around us for help. Because even though, yes, we have a responsibility to make a change here, we know this, but we don't want to be the marcher that does this change just to go bankrupt. We achieve nothing by doing that.
Well, a lot of jobs are lost as well, and healthcare, education, and the revenues that support those other rights are also lost. So we don't also want Scania to go out of business.
Yeah, well, on this last example, maybe we can also add there is in South Korea, I think, an island, but also is totally electric. The Jeju, or the name doesn't pop up, maybe the Koreans know. Huh? Jeju, yes, it's also totally electric. By the way, in the Netherlands today was a report published that it doesn't help totally, because if we all go electric, there's still air pollution coming from the tiles. And so for children and vulnerable people, it's still an issue that what they get into their, let's say, in their body, air pollution is still not yet solved. So there's more to be done. But going back to the questions, I agree with the gentleman here, the professor. I think from you had the question, should there be a specific impact assessment on climate change? And I fully agree. I think we have the social environmental impact assessments, that's known, but the climate change is, as a specific one, much broader, as you say. It's totally linked to so many issues, it should be developed, and maybe soon. As we're talking about, we have to act quick. So I agree. Also to the question of the lady in the back saying, yeah, what if the things go on? If it voluntary doesn't work, they still lock the forest and what have you. Well, it reminds me of a judge of the International Court in The Hague. And he came from this region. His name, I can look it up, but I don't have it here available, his name. He was a judge in the International Court in The Hague. He said, there's one thing still missing in international law. That's the underdevelopment of the environmental international law. And I think this is also an issue where states quickly, we all together have to act. And we are here together with UN institutions. How far are we with this? With international law on environment, it's underdeveloped. And so I think that if something like that happens, that you hope that soon you also can bring maybe a company to the International Court if they destroy the land or a region or whatever for many people or for all of us. There is maybe ground for that. But I'd like to hear maybe you can comment on that.
My comment would be on Dr. Surya's question regarding collective impact assessment. The march of towards climate justice, the direction is towards that point. More and more people are asking, although you did mention earlier also that there are independent responsibilities, but now more and more people, shareholders, stakeholders are demanding, are injecting that notion of collective responsibility, where also that important concept of due diligence is actually, due diligence promotes that notion of collective responsibility. Earlier, the responsibility of financial institutions in changing behavior, in addressing climate change was adverted to. Laws are being considered now, where specific obligations regarding collective responsibilities are being determined. Governments are being sued and are also are suing themselves. They themselves are being sued and they're suing. And it's carbon majors. Private parties are suing both governments and companies, etc. There's this trend of calling parties to account, and there's also a demand for transparency. So I think in the next few decades, this notion of approaching this issue collectively will come into fruition, as they're already happening actually.
Great. Thank you very much to all our speakers. I did say I would take one more question, but I do note that we're out of time. So unless somebody has one question for one speaker, I'm going to move on. Would that be you, Christina? Would you be the one person with one question for the one speaker? Please.
Well, I'd love to be that person. Thank you very much. This has been a very rich panel. I just wanted to make a final comment. The OECD guidelines may not specifically mention climate change throughout, but they say that companies have to carry out due diligence to identify, prevent, and address all risks, not only human rights risks, it's all risks. That includes climate risk. And it may be difficult for companies to deal with the climate impacts throughout their supply chains, but they are not supposed to deal only with the easy-to-deal-with risks. They are supposed to deal with all the risks. And climate change is an urgency for the entire world, so this is the risk that companies have to deal with. And we have been talking about policy coherence in the earlier panel. Well, we should also talk about company coherence. In the companies, you have experts, supply chain experts dealing with human rights due diligence. They should talk to their colleagues dealing with climate change. And maybe they can also unite forces and carry out impact assessment and due diligence throughout the supply chain to identify human rights issues, climate issues, and all kinds of environmental issues like fossil fuels in the sea, etc. So applying due diligence is about applying a risk management tool, and that a company is able to do that through their entire risk. So I would invite really companies, experts within companies, to talk to each other and exchanges experience in identifying, preventing, and addressing all the risks in their supply chain. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Christina, from OECD, in fact. And of course, Dr. Davis from the UN Working Group. I'm not sure he introduced himself as such. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for, as Christina said, a very rich panel discussion. I would like to just, as all of you leave, challenge you to go, when you go back to your homes, back to your organizations, to do your part to break down the silo between climate change and human rights. Thank you very much, everybody. We'll reconvene at 4.
Thank you, everyone. The next session starts at 4 o'clock. The coffee break is served outside. Go to your next session at 4.